The second Jasmine Crockett walked into the hearing room, you could feel the temperature drop. It wasn't cold, just that prickle on your skin when you know something is about to go off. Byron Donalds was already seated at the long table, flipping through a binder thick with glossy charts. He looked too calm. The cameras loved that. But they loved Jasmine more. This wasn't just another budget hearing. It was the first time someone had dared to question, on record, how a man who called himself a self-made champion for the working class had somehow doubled his personal wealth while entire districts in Florida and Texas were lining up at food banks. Jasmine didn't waste time. She adjusted the microphone and let the silence grow heavy. The audience behind her shifted in their seats, phones up, ready to record. She knew what they were thinking. Was she really going to say it out loud? "Congressman Donalds," she began, her tone even, "before we start pretending this is about policy disagreements, can you confirm for the record the total value of your personal investments in the last 5 years?" Donalds didn't flinch, at least, not in the way most people would. He smiled, the kind of smile that looks polished until you realize it's just another version of a flinch. "Congresswoman," he replied, leaning back, "my finances are transparent. Everything's been disclosed as required." "That's cute," she said, and the word landed like a slap. "Because here's the thing." She lifted a single sheet of paper. No theatrics. Just one page. But the way she held it up, the entire room leaned forward. Even the stenographer's fingers slowed. "This is an amended disclosure from last year," she continued. "It shows you purchased shares in a defense contractor 3 weeks before you publicly opposed funding for food assistance. Do you remember that vote?" Donalds shifted in his chair. "Just slightly. But it was enough." Outside the building, the clip was already being uploaded. And Jasmine? She hadn't even started yet. Byron Donalds opened his mouth to respond, but Jasmine didn't give him the chance. She slid the document across the table with a precision that felt almost surgical. The camera zoomed in, capturing every word on the header: amended financial disclosure, statement of holdings, FI 2024. "Let's be clear," she said, voice low and measured. "This isn't about partisan spin. This is about a pattern. While your constituents were trying to decide whether to buy groceries or pay rent, you were diversifying your portfolio with companies that profit when social programs fail." A few staffers along the wall exchanged looks. No one interrupted her. No one dared. Donalds exhaled through his nose, tapping his pen against the table like he was trying to find a rhythm to steady himself. "Congresswoman, I understand the need to grandstand," he began. She lifted her hand, just enough to stop him cold. "Grandstanding," she repeated softly, "is what you do when you sell a narrative that says poverty is a personal failing instead of a systemic design. I'm not here to perform for the cameras. I'm here to ask you, to your face, how you sleep at night knowing you made it harder for the same families you claim to fight for." The gallery behind them had gone silent. Reporters' thumbs hovered over their screens. Everyone was waiting to see if he'd take the bait and fire back. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She pulled out another document, a printout of an internal email. "This," she said, "is correspondence from your office dated February 8. In it, your staff discusses strategies to oppose emergency housing relief while, quote, exploring investment opportunities in private real estate development." Donalds blinked, and for a moment, his practiced calm faltered. "You think nobody would ever look," she continued, her voice gaining force. "That you could stand on a stage and talk about bootstrap grit and the evils of government dependence while quietly setting yourself up to profit from desperation." Her gaze locked onto his, unblinking. "You didn't just vote against aid," she said. "You monetized suffering." For a heartbeat, no one moved. No one breathed. And Jasmine Crockett sat back in her chair like she'd been waiting her whole life to put that truth on the record. The chairperson cleared his throat, trying to steady the room, but it was too late. The gallery had erupted in a soft, collective gasp, the kind that happens when people realize something they suspected was actually true. A staffer behind Jasmine pressed record on her phone, lips parted in shock. Byron Donalds glanced at the printout like he was seeing it for the first time. Maybe he was. Maybe someone on his team hadn't told him how blunt the email was. But Jasmine didn't care about his excuses. "You've called government programs a waste," she said evenly, her hand resting on the folder. "But you never called it a waste when you were lobbying for tax abatements on developments you had a stake in." His jaw tightened. She could see it, the flicker of resentment, the impulse to deflect, to pivot back to safer ground. But she didn't leave him that exit. "When you're a public servant," she continued, her voice calm but cutting, "your job is to protect the public, not your own investments. And if you can't tell the difference, you shouldn't be sitting in that seat." He opened his mouth to object. She held up one finger. "You keep saying you care about the American dream. But what exactly does that dream look like to you? A mother working 3 jobs to afford a studio apartment while her representative buys up foreclosed homes at a discount? A veteran getting denied housing vouchers while you call it market correction on Fox News?" People were no longer just watching, they were leaning in, scribbling, filming. The room felt charged, like it could explode any second. Donalds tried again, voice brittle. "Congresswoman Crockett, you're cherry-picking details without context." Jasmine's eyes locked onto his. "You're right. Let's give it context." She pulled out a final document, an infographic she'd prepared. It showed housing prices, eviction rates, and a timeline of his votes. The visuals were brutal in their clarity. "This isn't cherry-picking," she said. "This is a pattern." Someone in the audience whispered, "Damn," just loud enough to be heard on the hot mic. Another person stifled a nervous laugh. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She let the numbers hang there, undeniable. "People are tired of hearing that the free market will fix everything," she said, her voice almost soft now. "Because what they've learned is that the free market fixes nothing, except the pockets of the already powerful." She set the papers down with a finality that made the hair stand up on the back of more than a few necks. And in that moment, Byron Donalds realized the hearing wasn't just going to be another political skirmish, it was going to be the one people remembered. The committee room settled into an eerie quiet, the kind of silence that meant no one was looking away, no one was checking their phone. They were waiting to see whether Byron Donalds would stand his ground or try to crawl out from under the weight Jasmine had just dropped in front of him. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of the microphone, eyes darting between the chairperson and the stack of papers. "Congresswoman, I'm not going to sit here and let you smear my reputation." "No one has to smear anything," Jasmine interrupted, her voice crisp. "Your record is your record." He tried to laugh, an empty, defensive sound that didn't fool anyone. "I have invested in my community. I've created jobs." She didn't blink. "And you've created loopholes big enough to drive a moving truck through. Let's talk about that." He shifted in his chair, exhaling hard. "Over the last 5 years," Jasmine went on, "you voted against rent stabilization, affordable housing subsidies, and veterans assistance grants, while personally acquiring properties in districts you knew would benefit from those votes." A low murmur rippled through the back rows. Byron's face darkened, but she kept going, voice unwavering. "You talk about lifting people out of poverty," she said, tapping the infographic again. "But the truth is you profited from policies that kept them there." His jaw clenched, and for a second, he looked like he might fire back. But then he glanced over her shoulder, he saw the aides recording, the reporters scribbling, the young organizers who'd driven in from 3 states just to watch this unfold. He understood, maybe for the first time, that he wasn't in control of this narrative anymore. Jasmine adjusted her mic, never breaking eye contact. "You said last month that federal assistance was a crutch that stifles ambition," she reminded him, her tone quiet but unrelenting. "I'd like you to look into this camera," she gestured to the C-SPAN rig, and say that again to every senior citizen who's been evicted because their rent went up 70%. He didn't speak. The silence stretched, so raw you could almost taste it. You want to talk ambition? Jasmine pressed on. You want to talk about who deserves a chance? Then let's be honest about whose ambition you've been funding, yours. It wasn't just a line, it was a turning point. One of those moments that lands in a headline before the clip even finishes playing. And Jasmine knew it. She leaned back in her chair, hands folded over her notes, voice steady as steel. I'm not here to play politics with people's lives, she said. And I'm not here to let you pretend this is anything other than what it is, a system designed to enrich a few and abandon everyone else. In the front row, a woman who'd been evicted 2 years prior was crying silently. A young man behind her mouthed, "Thank you." Jasmine didn't look for the reaction. She stayed locked on Byron, refusing to offer him any comfortable exit. Because sometimes, the truth wasn't a debate. Sometimes, it was a reckoning. The cameras were still rolling when Byron Donalds finally leaned into the microphone. His voice sounded measured, but the tightness around his eyes gave him away. "Congresswoman, you act like you know my motives," he said, working to keep his tone calm. "But you don't. I'm here to promote economic growth, to create opportunity." Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even bother glancing at her notes. "You mean your economic growth," she said, her voice low but unmistakably clear. "Your opportunity." He tried to interrupt, but she raised her hand, palm facing him in a silent command that no one dared to challenge. "You claim you're lifting up families," Jasmine continued, "but let's do the math together. Your public disclosures show you personally acquired over $2.4 million in rental properties. That's legal," he snapped, unable to hide the irritation any longer. "Oh, it's legal," she agreed, her tone turning razor sharp. "It's just not ethical. There's a difference, and you know it." She slid another document across the table, slow, deliberate, like she had all the time in the world. "This is an eviction notice," she said. "From one of your properties. A mother of 3. She fell behind by $600. You could have worked out a payment plan. Instead, you doubled her rent the month after voting against rental relief." He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For a moment, the only sounds were the cameras clicking, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and the thud of a few hearts beating faster. Jasmine's voice softened, not out of mercy but because she knew a soft tone sometimes cut deeper. "You keep saying you're a man of faith," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "You keep saying you believe in community. Tell me," she paused, letting the question dangle. "When exactly did profit become more sacred to you than people?" He swallowed, hard enough the microphone caught it. "And that was when it happened, the moment everyone watching knew he'd lost." Because it wasn't just that he didn't have an answer. It was that he looked like a man who'd been forced to see himself without all the slogans, without the press releases, without the rehearsed lines. Raw. Exposed. Undeniably accountable. And Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't smirk or lean back in triumph. She just nodded, as if to say, "This is what the truth feels like." And in homes across America, people who'd never heard of Byron Donalds before that day suddenly understood exactly who he was. For a long moment, the chamber seemed to hold its breath. Even the aides who were usually too busy texting or scribbling notes had gone still, as if they understood something rare was happening. Byron Donalds tried to regroup. He pressed his palms flat on the table and drew in a slow breath. But there was no confidence left in his posture, only a cautious, fragile calculation. "Congresswoman," he began, voice lower, "I don't think it's appropriate for you to imply." Jasmine lifted her chin a fraction of an inch. Her tone didn't change. But the energy shifted again, like she was about to close a door he didn't even realize he'd left open. "I'm not implying," she said evenly. "I'm stating." She turned to the committee chair. "I'd like unanimous consent to enter these financial records into the record," she said, her voice so calm it almost sounded bored. The chair glanced between them, then nodded. "So ordered." Jasmine looked back at Donalds. "I'm not here to argue your talking points. I'm here to talk about the people who trusted you. The same people you took campaign donations from while quietly buying up their neighborhoods, one foreclosure at a time." She reached into her folder again, this time pulling out a stack of letters, handwritten, some creased, some smudged. "Since you love to talk about your record," she continued, "let's read it in the voices of the people you forgot." She held up the first letter. "My name is Sheila Torres. I worked 2 jobs, too, and still couldn't pay rent when you raised it by $500. You told me at your town hall that you were helping the market. The market didn't come to my daughter's graduation because we couldn't afford gas that week." The words didn't sound like political theater. They sounded like a confession the country needed to hear. A ripple moved across the gallery. Reporters shifted, angling their cameras for a better shot. Even the C-SPAN feed operator seemed to zoom in, sensing that no clip from the entire hearing would matter more than this. Byron's eyes darted to the letters, as if he might find some justification hidden in the smudged ink. Jasmine didn't pause. She read a second letter. Then a third. Each voice more intimate, more unpolished, more real. And by the time she finished, no one was wondering whether she'd gone too far. They were wondering why no one else had dared to go this far before. When she finally set the stack of letters down, she leaned forward just enough to close the last inch of space between her voice and his composure. "You say you care about families," she said, softer now. "But all I see is a man who made himself rich on their desperation, and called it policy." He swallowed again. And that's when she let the silence come back. Not because she needed to catch her breath, but because she knew the silence would echo longer than any speech ever could. For a few heartbeats, Byron Donalds didn't say a word. The tension thickened into something almost physical, like you could reach out and touch it in the air. All around them, the hearing room seemed transformed. This wasn't just a political skirmish anymore. This was a public reckoning that had waited too many years to happen. Jasmine didn't blink. She let the hush settle until it became clear he had no ready defense. No statistics, no slogan, no polished line that could make the letters in her hand disappear. Finally, Byron cleared his throat. "These issues are more complex than you." "They are," she interrupted gently. "But complexity doesn't erase accountability." The chair shifted uncomfortably but didn't intervene. No one wanted to interrupt a moment that was already becoming something larger than them. Jasmine set her papers aside. "You say the market dictates everything," she continued, her voice steady. "But it wasn't the market that knocked on families' doors and told them to leave. It wasn't the market that bought up the mortgages of military widows and retired teachers. It was you, and the shell companies you funded." She let that hang there, unflinching. A woman in the gallery, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, a notepad pressed to her knees, exhaled audibly, like she'd been holding her breath since Jasmine started speaking. And still, Donalds didn't move. "Do you know what happens to a community when every promise made to it is broken for profit?" Jasmine asked, quieter now. "You don't just bankrupt their bank accounts. You bankrupt their hope." Someone in the back murmured, "Amen." Jasmine lifted her eyes to meet his, and her voice took on the softness of a knife sliding into its sheath. "You built an empire on evictions, Congressman," she said. "But you can't evict the truth." Donalds pressed his lips together. He glanced at the committee chair, hoping for rescue. But no one came. Jasmine slowly stacked her documents and folded her hands. "Whatever happens after today, remember this," she said, never raising her tone above conversational calm. "The people you displaced will remember. The mothers, the grandfathers, the children who lost the only home they had. And when you go back to your donors and call that success. She paused, her eyes steady. I call it theft. The reporters were scribbling so fast their pens nearly tore the paper. The clip was already being chopped into sound bites that would ricochet across every platform before nightfall. And Jasmine knew it. She wasn't performing. She was documenting. For all the power Byron Donalds wielded, committee seats, corporate ties, a golden reputation among donors, there was one thing he couldn't buy back in that hearing room, the perception that he cared. And Jasmine Crockett knew it. She leaned forward, elbows resting on the folder that had already unraveled the facade he'd spent a career perfecting. Congressman, she began, voice so composed it almost sounded gentle, you've talked a lot about personal responsibility today. Donalds lifted his chin, trying to reclaim the authority she'd just carved away from him. But I've noticed, she continued, that every time you're asked about the actual consequences of your policies, families priced out, senior citizens evicted, veterans turned away, your response is always the same. She paused, letting the room hold its breath. It's never your fault. A ripple of tension passed through the gallery. A man in a gray suit shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the cameras that were now laser-focused on the congressman's expression. Donalds bristled. I don't think this is inappropriate. It's entirely appropriate, Jasmine cut in, her tone still perfectly even. Because today isn't about your donors. It's about the Americans whose lives you helped dismantle one transaction at a time. She reached for a slim binder labeled Case Study, Florida Foreclosures. These are the names of 347 families evicted from properties you held controlling interests in, she said, tapping the cover lightly. You may call it the free market. I call it state-sponsored greed. Her words weren't loud. But they carried a force that no raised voice ever could. Donalds tried to laugh it off, but the sound died halfway out of his throat. He glanced at the chairman, but again, no lifeline came. Jasmine flipped the binder open to a tabbed page with photos clipped to the margins. This is the Hernandez family, she said, sliding the page forward so the cameras could catch it. 2 parents, 3 children. Their youngest has cystic fibrosis. They were evicted with 12 days' notice. Your firm marked the property up by 300% and called it revitalization. She didn't blink. This is the truth you can't bury behind an index fund. Donalds opened his mouth, but no words came. And for the first time in the hearing, it was clear he understood, the fortune that made him untouchable in every other room had just become the very thing that defined him here. A cold silence settled, punctuated only by the clicking of a journalist's camera. Jasmine exhaled once, slow and steady, then folded her hands. And before you try to spin this as some partisan spectacle, she said quietly, remember that evictions don't check voter registration. Poverty doesn't care how you vote. She let that truth land, unchallenged. And the entire room knew, no amount of prepared remarks or polished press releases could put the mask back on. For a long moment, nobody moved. The hush that settled over the hearing room was the kind of stillness that happens when the air has been sucked out of a space, when everyone realizes at once that something irreversible just happened. Jasmine didn't flinch. She sat with her hands calmly folded over the evidence, looking Byron Donalds straight in the eye. No hatred. No smugness. Just a gaze so level that it was worse than any shouted accusation. She spoke again, softer this time, but somehow heavier. You want to call this a witch hunt. You want to say this is political theater. But the reality is simpler than that. This is accountability. Donalds cleared his throat, the microphone catching the edge of a tremor he probably wished wasn't there. He picked up his pen and put it back down. Then he reached for his water, but his hand hesitated halfway, as though he'd realized everyone was watching that, too. I've already stated, he began, voice lower, that foreclosures are an unfortunate consequence of profit, Jasmine finished for him, her tone still neutral. Of corporate consolidation. Of treating homes like poker chips. A few people shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with how exposed he looked. But she wasn't done. She lifted a second file, labeled Public Subsidies. This is the record of federal relief funds your companies received during the same period you were evicting families, she said. $27 million. Donalds didn't deny it. He just looked back at her, jaw clenched. I suppose you'll call that capitalism, too, she continued, her voice almost quiet enough that people had to lean in. But from where I sit, it looks a lot like hypocrisy. A staffer near the back pressed a hand to his mouth, as if he'd been holding his breath. Do you have anything, she asked, anything at all to say to the families whose homes you took, while you were cashing checks from the very taxpayers you displaced? She waited. The cameras waited. The country waited. And when Donald said nothing, just lowered his eyes for the briefest flicker, it was more damning than any outburst could have been. That was the moment the hearing turned from spectacle to reckoning. Jasmine leaned back slightly. That's what I thought. She let the words hang, cool and deliberate, until the chairman finally cleared his throat and tried to reclaim the rhythm of the proceedings. But it didn't matter, because everybody knew that no closing remarks could paper over the silence that had just swallowed Byron Donalds whole. A silence that, for once, sounded a lot like the truth. Hours later, long after the committee room had emptied and the last camera crew had rolled up their cables, there was a quiet in the halls that didn't feel like any ordinary end-of-day hush. It was the kind of quiet that follows something seismic. Reporters were still gathering quotes in the lobby. Staffers were still fielding calls from news desks scrambling to rewrite headlines. But Jasmine Crockett had already slipped into a small side corridor, away from the swarm. She walked slowly, her binder hugged against her chest, her mind replaying every moment of the hearing in sharp detail. A young congressional aide, probably no older than 24, caught up to her, breathless. "Congresswoman," she said, voice small but earnest, I just wanted to say, that was the first time I've ever seen someone sit in that chair and not look afraid." Jasmine stopped. Looked her in the eye. "I was afraid," she said quietly. "But I was more tired of watching people pretend this is normal." The aide swallowed and nodded. Jasmine gave her a brief, steady smile before she kept walking. Meanwhile, Byron Donalds had retreated to a private conference room with his advisors. Someone closed the door. Someone else turned off their phone. But it was too late. Clips of his silence, of that exact second when he realized the room was no longer on his side, had already started flooding every platform imaginable. On TikTok, a 15-second video was going viral under the hashtag #ReceiptsNotRhetoric. It showed Jasmine calmly laying out the subsidy figures, her tone unwavering, while a caption scrolled over the screen. "Imagine stealing homes and calling it leadership." On Twitter, people weren't debating whether the moment was staged. They weren't dissecting her delivery. They were simply saying, over and over, that they felt seen. One user wrote, "My mom was evicted in 2009 by people just like him. I've never heard anyone say it out loud like this." Another posted, "Jasmine didn't just check him. She checked a whole system." The next morning, cable news couldn't decide how to spin it. Some called it a political ambush. Others called it a masterclass in moral clarity. But for the families watching in small apartments, in motels, in borrowed spare rooms, what mattered wasn't the labels. It was that someone with power had finally named the thing nobody ever named. And for Byron Donalds, that was the hardest part. Because no statement he issued, no carefully drafted rebuttal, could erase the image of a man who had all the money, all the connections, all the practiced confidence, and nothing left to say when confronted by the truth. Later that afternoon, Jasmine sat by her office window. She was exhausted, her throat sore, her inbox flooded with messages she knew she wouldn't be able to answer for days. But she didn't regret a single word. A senior staffer peeked in, holding up a printout of the latest view counts. It's everywhere, he said. Millions of people. She nodded, almost to herself. Good, she murmured. But this isn't the finish line. It's the start. Out in the country, far from Capitol Hill, there were families who would never see this hearing. But maybe, just maybe, they'd feel a little less invisible because of it. And sometimes, she thought, that was enough to keep going. Before you click away, I want you to sit with this for just a second. We just witnessed something that wasn't polished spin or a made-for-TV moment. We saw what it looks like when someone dares to say the truth out loud, even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs them something. Because here's the thing, Byron Donalds didn't walk into that hearing expecting a real reckoning. He thought it would be another performance, another opportunity to deflect and dismiss. But Jasmine Crockett proved that facts still matter, that receipts still matter, and that courage doesn't always show up with shouting. Sometimes, it shows up in calm, undeniable clarity. If this story moved you, if you felt even an ounce of recognition in the words she spoke, don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it. Remember it the next time someone tells you that power can't be challenged. Because it can. And today, you just saw exactly how.